The macabre history of the Ashford family, a sinister Talith house on Wicker Lane. You wouldn't notice the Ashford house if you weren't looking for it. Hidden behind a crooked gate on the edge of Wiltshire, the old Georgian estate rests like a corpse in a silk shroud, preserved and pale, with windows like eyes that had seen too much. The locals still avoid it, not because of superstition, but because of what is known. And yet, if you stood at the gates and simply waited, you might hear the wind carrying the names of its former residents, all faded from the public memory, but once whispered with dread. The Ashford name first entered English land records in 1728, when Silas Ashford, a retired naval quartermaster with suspicious wartime wealth, purchased 48 acres near the village of Lower Harrow. According to archived parish documents, Silas was a man of perpetual absence, meaning he spent more time away from the estate than within its walls. It was said he brought with him 7 trunks of artifacts, which he stored in the cellar, items no one was allowed to see. Rumors in the village implied he had served in the West Indies, where he was known for brutal punishment of sailors, and for collecting shrunken heads from his travels. This was never proven, but neither was it denied. What is documented is the unusual architectural additions Silas ordered within the first 2 years. He had a bricked-in well covered over with polished iron. He built a windowless room behind the kitchen lined with salt bricks, and he demanded, quite inexplicably, that all clocks on the property be wound backward. Several receipts for custom horological adjustments kept today at the Wiltshire County Archive confirm this. Silas had 3 children. The eldest, Edwin, was said to be of sound mind. The second, Margaret, died at the age of 12 under unclear circumstances. The third, Thomas, was known locally as Thomas the Pale, as he was rarely seen outdoors, save for at dusk. A surviving diary from a housemaid, Elizabeth Durant, paints a chilling image. Master Thomas speaks to no one, save to his bird, which he keeps beneath a cover. I've not heard it sing. The family's descent into scandal became public after Edwin's unexpected death in 1757. He was found drowned in the ornamental pond, though he had no known ailments and was an excellent swimmer. A coroner's inquest ruled it an accident, but the vicar of St. Anne's, Reverend Colefield, wrote in a private note that the body was stiff but dry about the mouth, no water in the lungs. His death is not of this world. The note was not entered into the official record. After Edwin's death, Silas became a recluse, rarely eating and locking himself in the cellar. Servants began to quit in droves. 1. Samuel Pritchard left behind a deposition claiming he heard chanting in foreign tongue, not Latin nor any German I've known. Another described a mask made of wax, melted to a human face. Of course, these accounts were considered sensational or the result of rural hysteria, but they are remarkably consistent across sources. The local constable tried to investigate, but found the estate legally protected by an obscure naval exemption, likely related to Silas's connections. This legal barrier held for decades, even after Silas's own death in 1761, which was discovered only when a stable boy noticed an unbearable smell leaking from beneath the floorboards. He had apparently sealed himself within the cellar with bricks and died among his collection. Most of his artifacts were never catalogued. His son, Thomas the Pale, inherited the estate. By then, Thomas had become almost a myth among locals. His skin, it was said, had never seen sun. He communicated through letters only. A delivery boy once glimpsed him through a cracked door and described him as a man not old, but not young, with hair the color of ash and hands blackened like coal. Thomas is an especially enigmatic figure, because he kept immaculate records, hundreds of pages stored in what is now the British Library's special collections. His journals detail his experiments in magnetoharmonic fields and the use of low frequencies to distort somatic rhythms. While this sounds like pseudoscience today, Thomas referenced known physicists of the time, including Luigi Galvani and Franz Mesmer. It is unclear whether his research had any foundation in accepted science, or whether it drove him to madness. Most bizarrely, Thomas never officially died. No death certificate was filed. In fact, In the 1801 census, Ashford House is listed as unoccupied, though tax payments continued to be made for another 34 years under the name T. Ashford-esque. This has led some to speculate whether Thomas died and was secretly buried, or whether someone, perhaps something, kept the illusion of his presence alive. In 1835, the property was sold to the Crown due to unpaid taxes, but the estate remained untouched until 1891, when it was briefly used as a storage site for archaeological finds. During this period, several workers reported severe insomnia and auditory hallucinations while on site. 1. A man named Harold Binnings wrote a letter to his sister claiming, "I hear a voice under the floor. It says my name in a whisper. I've never known." He was later institutionalized. The Ashford family may have only existed for 3 generations on paper, but the lore, the mystery, and the accumulated oddities turned a once nondescript house into a place of whispered terror. And yet, it is the mundane records, the delivery logs, the receipt stubs, the scribbled servant complaints that build the most complete picture of their slow descent into obscurity and madness. How could so many documents exist, yet tell us so little about who the Ashfords really were? The Salt Room and the Silencio have to imagine the Ashford estate not as it is today, empty, hallowed, part of the English Heritage Registry, but as it was in the decades after Thomas the Pale vanished. The house did not rot right away. For a time, it sat untouched, preserved as if waiting for its inhabitants to return. Even the salt room behind the kitchen remained sealed for nearly a century, until a team of historians in 1933 finally broke through the plaster. What they found baffled and disturbed even the most grounded academic minds of the era. The salt room was small, barely 10 feet across. It was lined, floor to ceiling, with blocks of rock salt imported from Salzburg, based on mineral analysis. There were no windows, no ventilation, no apparent purpose. But in the center sat an iron chair bolted to the floor with a leather harness. A faint scorch pattern surrounded the base, suggesting fire or extreme heat, and carved into the walls, in a language resembling early Akkadian or Ugaritic, were repeated phrases, "Listen backward," and "Do not breathe in time." None of this appears in public records. These findings were first detailed in a confidential paper by Professor Lionel Beckwith, an antiquarian with a focus on alchemical symbolism. His notes, later leaked, suggested that the salt room was not for torture but for containment. Containment of what? He would not say, but he repeatedly referred to resonant entities and non-chronal phenomena. His language was precise yet maddeningly vague, and he died of a brain aneurysm. A few months later, many dismissed him as delusional. Still, the evidence in the room, the minerals, the heat signature, the carvings remains indisputable. Around this time, a wave of renewed curiosity brought journalists and paranormal investigators to Ashford House. Some sought evidence of the occult. Others chased more grounded scandals, missing servants, unsolved deaths, unpaid debts. But most left disappointed. The property seemed more haunting than haunted. No apparitions, no cold spots, just a silence so thick it pressed on the chest, and always that faint iron smell that never faded, even after a century of disuse. It was during this phase that the British government quietly restricted access to the Ashford archives. Several researchers, including a folklorist named Ada Morgan, reported being denied entry to files labeled Ashford Correspondence, 1758 to 1834. She claimed in her memoirs that some of the Ashford letters were detailed accounts of auditory experiments involving low-frequency sound and deep-sea acoustics years before such science formally existed. She was discredited by her peers. But curiously, many of the files she cited are now indeed missing from the Wiltshire Records Office. The villagers of Lower Harrow, meanwhile, developed their own theories, none pleasant. It was widely believed that the Ashfords were listeners, a term used to describe those who claimed to hear natural forces no one else could. In older folk tales, listeners were considered cursed. Once you heard the true frequency, it would call to you for the rest of your life. One tale spoke of a woman who slit her ears to silence the sound. Another, of a stable boy who vanished, leaving behind a letter that simply read, The floor sang to me. Asterisk. What is known is that these stories predate the Ashfords by at least a century. A 1612 burial record for a woman named Ilsa Gorwin notes she was found dead within the wood, ear pressed to earth, eyes wide with terror. Her cottage was less than 2 miles from the future Ashford estate, so either the family moved to a place already steeped in myth, or they seeded the myth themselves. Asterisk. There is also the matter of the birds. Asterisk. Multiple caretakers over the years have reported birds, especially magpies, dying en masse on the estate. In the 1920s, a groundskeeper named Charles Linwood wrote in his work journal, every morning, another black and white heap at the porch. No wounds, no rot, just stillness. His notes also describe an odd behavior, birds flying in perfect spirals above the salt room, even before it was publicly revealed. When scientists tested the area in the 1960s, they found minor but measurable magnetic disturbances directly above that section of the house. Nothing strong enough to harm a person, but enough to affect compass needles and potentially navigation-dependent animals. Asterisk. The birds were not the only concern. Several workers hired to maintain the estate reported hearing whispers at 4 a.m., always at that same hour, regardless of season. One gardener claimed that he could never find the source, but that the whispers were not malicious, just tired. Another, a carpenter, said he was awoken from sleep by the sound of his own name being spoken. But from below me, he was staying on the top floor. Asterisk. Eventually, in 1971, the estate was sealed off after a young boy wandered onto the property and was found days later, uninjured but entirely mute. His drawings, kept by the family and later donated to a private museum, showed a tall figure with multiple arms standing at the edge of the salt room, watching him. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with trauma-induced aphasia. He never spoke again. Asterisk. To this day, the house remains under restricted access. Wiltshire County claims it is structurally unsound, though several surveys contradict this. The National Trust offered to preserve it as a historical site, but was denied, and a 2016 petition to open the estate for paranormal research was quietly removed from public forums. No reason was ever given. Asterisk. But still, the story is not about hauntings or conspiracies. The real strangeness of the Ashfords lies in the documents, the dates, the paperwork, dozens of routine letters, requests for salt imports, receipts for clockwork repairs, payment slips for unusually large mirror deliveries. Everything feels perfectly mundane until it doesn't. Asterisk. Why did a retired naval man with no background in acoustics build a house full of sound-manipulating architecture? Why did his son, a recluse, speak only in letters while designing experiments in harmonic disruption? Why did their records survive, yet none of their identities ever make it into textbooks? Asterisk. And what does it mean that, even now, the floor beneath the salt room cannot be scanned due to unexplained material interference? Asterisk. Beneath the salto, understand what rests beneath the salt room. You have to first understand the Ashford method of record keeping. While most landed families in 18th and 19th century Britain documented finances, lineage, and estate inventories in ledgers or journals, the Ashfords recorded theirs on what can only be described as auditory scrolls. These were long, parchment sheets notated in glyph-like sequences, interspersed with phonetic fragments and rhythmic annotations. Historians have debated for years whether these were codes, musical compositions, or merely the obsessive writings of a fractured mind. The leading theory today is that they were sound maps possibly tuned to resonate within the estate's architectural features. Asterisk. One scroll, recovered in 1933 and stored in the British Museum's closed archives, was found sealed in a brass cylinder behind a fireplace. Its contents were catalogued but never translated, but it included a diagram that precisely matched the dimensions of the salt room, except for one addition, a spiral staircase descending below it, ending in a hexagonal chamber. The chamber does not exist in any blueprints, but attempts to excavate beneath the room have repeatedly failed. Asterisk. According to documents filed in the 1990s under the Wiltshire County Historical Restoration Project, 3 attempts were made to dig below the salt room. Each time, equipment failed. Once, a drill bit Simply vanished, no resistance, no debris. Another time, the concrete beneath the salt blocks seemed to regrow after being removed. Even thermal scans revealed nothing, just an opaque zone where nothing registered at all. The lead engineer at the time, Marcus Farrell, wrote in his report, "It's not that we can't see through the floor. It's that there is no signal coming back, as if it swallows it." More chillingly, several workers involved in the excavation reported the same dream within 24 hours of exposure, walking down a staircase of bone toward a hum that vibrated the teeth, only to wake before reaching the bottom. None had spoken to each other before reporting it, and none returned to the site afterward. While this would be enough to earn the house its reputation, the story takes another turn, this time far from Wiltshire, in the archives of the Royal Navy. In 2007, a researcher named Thomas Gooden uncovered a logbook from HMS Wren, a vessel active during the 1740s. It includes entries from a Lieutenant Silas Ashford. Most are routine wind speeds, supply notes, disciplinary records. But one entry stands out, a report of a suboceanic pulsing heard off the coast of Sierra Leone. Ashford noted that the crew began to feel ill ears ringing, blood noses, sleepwalking. The event lasted for 7 hours. Upon return to Britain, Ashford resigned his commission, citing unrecoverable mental burden. That date, April 3, 1746, matches the purchase of a large mirror from a shipping firm in Bristol, delivered to Ashford House. What would cause a naval man to resign, then immediately install a 7-foot polished obsidian mirror inside a windowless brick room, lined with salt, unless he brought something back with him, something he didn't understand, something he needed to contain? It would be easy to dismiss all this as coincidence, a few strange documents, a legacy of local folklore. But the Ashfords left behind something rare: continuity. Their behaviors, their obsessions, their architectural oddities spanned 3 generations. Patterns persisted, rooms with no purpose, doors that opened nowhere, a library of texts written not for the eye but for the ear. And in every era, reports of silence, disorientation, and most of all sound that came from beneath. Even modern science has not offered satisfactory explanations. Magnetic mapping shows disturbances within a tight vertical shaft below the estate. Seismographs detect microtremors only at specific intervals between 3:41 and 4:09 a.m. GPS signals fail briefly when passing through the estate's southern field. And oddly, recordings taken inside the salt room all show faint tones at 17 Hz, the so-called ghost frequency, known to induce anxiety, disorientation, and hallucinations. But none of that explains the tapes. In 1984, a private investigator named Graham Folsom conducted unauthorized explorations of the estate. He placed audio recorders in several locations, including the salt room, cellar, and attic. What he captured is now infamous among archivists: 10 minutes of low, rhythmic pulses followed by a voice undeniably human whispering the word return, in 5-second intervals, for 10 minutes, always the same, return, and then silence. Folsom was found in his car 2 days later, catatonic. He never spoke again. His notes were destroyed in a house fire in 1986, the tape misfiled for years before resurfacing in a BBC archive under the label Ashford Anomalies. Why did they build the salt room? Why did Thomas disappear? What was it the Ashfords were trying to suppress, study, or survive? Theories range from sound-based weaponry to early neuroscience, to the occult, but perhaps the truth is more banal, and therefore more terrifying. Perhaps the Ashfords discovered something we were not meant to perceive, a frequency, a vibration, a resonance not of our time or world, but buried like them underneath everything we know. They did not seek glory. They did not write manifestos. They only left behind strange echoes, faded documents. In a house that repels the living, their history is not one of grand wars or kings or revolutions. It is quieter than that, more precise, more patient, a slow unraveling of reason by something deeper, something ancient. And the house still stands, sealed, untouched, waiting, Asterisk what happens if someone breaks the salt seal again. Asterisk.